So the individual producer has to eat this levy. That gets to be unfair. Another thing I would like to see at some point is much more credit be given for the activities that farmers are doing that's holding carbon, that's keeping it from escaping into the air, whether it's grazing lands or other mechanisms of storing carbon in the soil or in the forest. These are things that we really do need to be granting more credits to try to offset some of the negative impacts financially that people are suffering right now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Fireside Chats with Erin. I'm your host, Erin Gowerluck. As Executive Director of the Grain Growers of Canada, I started this podcast to serve as a forum for real conversations with industry influencers and policymakers. Joining us today is Senator Diane Griffin. Senator Griffin hails from Prince Edward Island and serves as the chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Agriculture and Forestry. She's also a member of the Senate Standing Committee on National Security and Defense, and serves as Senate Vice Chair on the Canada-U.S. Interparliamentary Group. Senator, thank you for stopping by for a fireside chat.
Great to be here. I love talking to you. We always have such great conversations.
We do, and I'm thinking this time last year, you were joining us in Quebec City for the Grain Growers annual summer meeting. We enjoyed lovely weather there and an opportunity to get together face to face. It's unfortunate that this year the Grain Growers summer meeting, like many summer meetings, has been postponed indefinitely. But we're getting used to now making these connections, I suppose, virtually now from your home on the island and me here in the nation's capital. But it's good to hear your voice and to see your face.
Oh, thank you.
So I want to start with a bit of background, if I may. You were appointed to the Senate in 2016, but prior to that, you worked in land conservation. You were the Natural Areas Coordinator in Alberta for 8 years, which is where I lived for 21 years before moving to the nation's capital. And then you moved back home to work for the Prince Edward Island Nature Trust. Then you served as the PEI Deputy Minister for Fisheries and the Environment, and then the PEI Program Director for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Looking at your biography, I see a lifetime of paid and voluntary work that's dedicated to preserving and protecting wildlife and the environment. How have those important experiences informed your work and approach as a senator?
Well, I think like everybody else, my background probably is very heavily influenced where I would come from on an issue. I really want to be on the Agriculture and Forestry Committee because I grew up on a farm, which gave me an appreciation for the outdoors and for growing things. Although picking potatoes in November was pretty cold, but other than that, it was great. Then when I went to university, the botany that I had learned in 4-H club stood me in very good stead when I got to biology class, and I got a summer job at the university collecting plants for their collection. So I would have to say, right from my beginning on the farm and in 4-H club through to the various jobs that I've had, I have been so fortunate. And, I just can't thank people enough, like my 4-H club leader, some of the professors I've had, some of the co-workers I've had. It's been a great career. I feel very fortunate, and it really informs every issue pretty well that comes before the Senate. From my viewpoint, it informs all the issues that I'm interested in.
And I want to talk about some of those issues. We have a few, I think, to catch up on. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the role of the Senate from your perspective. We're familiar with the Chamber's role as providing a sober second thought. How much of what we're seeing here now with senators directly calling on government through various forms of media, how much of that is more of an outspoken or activist Senate, perhaps, than we have seen in the past?
Oh, I think it is much more activist. There's a couple of reasons for that. There's many more forms of media now, especially social media. It's so much easier to communicate, but also the senators that have been appointed now are supposed to be serving as independents in the Senate. Therefore, you get more independent thinking. And there are selection committees in each province that are picking the candidates that apply for a Senate position. So instead of political partisanship, which was a priority in the past in most cases, they're now looking at people and their careers, and they're saying, well, we need more people with this kind of experience, or we feel this person would be able to speak up for Prince Edward Island, for example, or for this kind of an issue that's going to be very important to the government in this next year or two. So when the Prime Minister called me, he said that my background in conservation and in municipal politics was of interest. So I was glad there was a double interest.
Good. What do you make of this new approach of individual senators attempting to influence policy outcomes?
Well, I think like anything else, there may be pros and cons to it. The con is that the Senate's agenda or order paper can get fairly cluttered because a lot of us in there worked all our lives on certain issues, and we're there still promoting them. And the pro, though, is that it does bring issues to the fore and gets them debated. And another pro is that, by the way, senators have always been able to bring forward legislation and make motions in the Senate. But it seems that there are more issues and more motions in the last 2 or 3 years. So I think that's very proactive on senators' parts, and it shows that they are engaged in what they're doing. And I think that's very positive.
So as an organization, the Grain Growers of Canada, whose existence largely is built around advocating for the interests of Canadian farmers across the country, what advice do you have on how we should be communicating with senators?
Well, first of all, I think you're great communicators. You lobby your MPs, you lobby senators, you come to the Hill on lobby day. I see representatives of the grain growers every year in a number of fora, and it's great. And something else I really appreciate is that anytime the Agriculture and Forestry Committee has asked the grain growers to come and be an expert witness when we're doing one of our studies, you're always there. It's great. But you have to constantly remember that there are no farmers in the Senate and there's precious few in the House of Commons. So information through all forms of media, which you're very good at, is important to continue to do.
Okay, so information and an educational component probably necessary as well around some of the issues that we're working on.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask you, many of our members know you quite well because they've had the opportunity to interact with you in your role as chair of the Senate Standing Committee for Agriculture and Forestry. To your point, many of our members have had the opportunity to appear before the committee. In this role, you've presided over several studies, including the committee's most recent work, which was a report entitled Made in Canada, Growing Canada's Value-Added Food Sector. I'm asking all of our guests as of late to comment on the role that the agriculture sector can play as Canada recovers from the pandemic and this economic recession. And I want to ask you the same question, but in the context of the committee's more recent report. The report outlines a number of opportunities for government to support further development in Canada's agri-food sector. So with the recovery in mind, are there any recommendations in the report that would improve the sector's ability to reach its full potential and in so doing, contribute to Canada's economic recovery post-pandemic?
Well, I'd like to think most of the recommendations in the report would have a beneficial impact in this regard. We had, I believe it was 8 recommendations, but there's quite a few subsets to some of them. And it deals with everything from research, deals with collaborations between the various levels of government, deals with the carbon tax and carbon credits, deals with interprovincial trade and with transportation, among others. But as I say, there's many subsets to some of these recommendations. And what's really important here at the end of the day is that agriculture is going to be very, very key as we recover from the pandemic. There's several factors why. First of all, our own food security in this country, and I am concerned about food security. Another important factor would be that some other industries have either gone down now. I'm thinking of the petroleum and natural gas industry in Alberta. When I worked in Alberta, that was king. Agriculture kind of was in second place. Well, it's not going to be that way in the future. Agriculture and forestry are going to be so important in the Alberta recovery, along with other things like research and all the other work that's being done. But across Canada in total, agriculture is going to be important, not only because we need to feed our own population, but because we need to export in order to earn money to bring it back into the Canadian economy. So we would like to see much more value added in our own country so that we're not simply shipping out raw product. I mean, our product is great and everybody loves getting it and buying it, but then they add a lot of the value in their own country instead of us adding the value here. So there are a whole number of factors we have to look at related to the agriculture industry to make sure it plays the key role in the recovery that it can play. And a lot of the recommendations in the report relate to that. Everything from easing of government regulations so that we can move goods from one province to another. There's a lot of interprovincial trade barriers. You know, we hear all about the international trade deals, but it's the interprovincial trade barriers that are actually hurting a lot of our own provinces and their own industry.
In December of 2018, which was just before I started in my role as Executive Director with the Grain Growers of Canada, the committee released a report which included some analysis on the carbon tax and its impact on the agriculture sector in particular. The report included 16 recommendations in total, and one that called on Environment and Climate Change Canada to reconsider exemptions for the agriculture sector, in particular on the application of the carbon tax on the heating and cooling of on-farm buildings, and to go beyond mark fuel, applying the exemption to propane and natural gas. We will get to that one in a moment, but in revisiting the report, I wondered if any of these recommendations, any of the 16 recommendations that were included in that report back in December of 2018, have in fact been implemented or adopted by government.
Well, I guess, first off, I'd have to say, I'm very pleased to say that a lot of the reports have been accepted by the government. So they submitted a report, a response to us dated January the 17th, 2019. And Minister Bibeau, who then was minister and still is, in her covering letter had acknowledged the importance of the Senate's report in terms of promoting agriculture and making government aware of the issues. And basically, can I read it? her paragraph starts out, the government recognizes the vital importance of resilient agriculture, agri-food, and forest sectors that are able to adapt to climate change. And it is making great strides toward addressing issues identified by the committee in its report. Now, to be fair, a lot of work was already underway by Agriculture Canada, so it's not simply a response to our report, but therefore the minister was able to say the government supports this recommendation or that recommendation and indicate how it's being done, generally done under a more general framework or program that would already be in place, like the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change that all the federal and provincial ministers had adopted back in December 9th, 2016. So because agriculture is a shared responsibility between the federal and the provincial government, it's very important that all be on side with these general frameworks. But then, and it's amazing, for other recommendations, it's such a nice polite response saying the government acknowledges this issue. So, which, when I first read it, I was thrilled. Oh, the government acknowledges this issue. That's important. Then I realized acknowledges this issue. That's a little different than saying the government supports this issue or recommendation. So one of the ones is one that you had mentioned a moment ago, and that's related to the carbon tax and whether it can be expanded. The exemption can be expanded to cover propane and natural gas that are used for heating and cooling on farms and for drying grain. But at this point, all I've got is an acknowledgement of the issue and in conversation with the previous and the current Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Basically, they're quite leery of setting a precedent by making any more exemptions than what they've already made for the farm community. Now, I don't agree with that reasoning, but that is the government's stance, unfortunately.
No, you don't agree with that reasoning, because in February of this year, you presented a bill in the Senate, S-215. And this bill would seek to add propane and natural gas to the list of farm fuels exempt from the carbon tax, which was one of the recommendations outlined in the report that we were talking about. And it would also broaden the definition of eligible farming machinery to include property used for the purposes of providing heat or cooling a building or similar structure. And you referenced grain drying as something that's critically important. And we saw more recently, now we have an example of that. With the harvest from hell we talk about, which was last year's harvest, unfortunately, but there was really not one province across the country was exempt from the very challenging conditions that last year's harvest presented. So the grain drying was really something that was top of mind. But I'm curious, because as a senator from Prince Edward Island, a province that has a carbon levy system in place, which meets the requirements outlined by the federal government, why are you, of all people, feeling compelled to bring something like this forward?
Well, of course, senators are appointed for a number of reasons, one of which is to represent their province, another is to provide sober second thought, and another is to speak up for minorities. So those are reasons. But I also worked with the province of Alberta in the Department of Energy and Natural Resources for 8 years before moving back home to Prince Edward Island. So I feel Alberta's pain and what it's going through right now. But also, I look at it, I'm here to speak up for Prince Edward Island in the Senate and my region, but I also have to represent the interests of Canada. After all, I am a Canadian senator. I want our whole country to do well.
I have to ask, are you in favor of the carbon tax? Do you support the government's decision to put a price on carbon?
Generally, I do. This is a case of where I've spent a lot of time looking for these exemptions because they are important to the agriculture industry. But we do have to cut down on the amount of carbon that's being released in the atmosphere. I think everybody agrees on that. So many economists agree that the best way to do this is through a carbon levy or a carbon tax. So I'm okay with that. But when it starts to negatively impact our food security, then that part I'm not so okay with. So that's why the on-farm use that's already been exempted, that's good, but it's not so good in that it just didn't go far enough. I think the exemptions that are needed now are for the heating and cooling of barns and other buildings and for drying of grain, because that's the bottom line coming off of farmers' incomes. They're, as you folks have told me, you're price takers, you're not price makers. So the individual producer has to eat this levy. That gets to be unfair. Another thing I would like to see at some point is much more credit be given for the activities that farmers are doing that's holding carbon, that's keeping it from escaping into the air, whether it's grazing lands or other mechanisms of storing carbon in the soil or in the forest. These are things that we really do need to be granting more credits to try to offset some of the negative impacts financially that people are suffering right now.
Well, and I'm glad you raised the issue of practice change, because a lot of those, I think, at the farm level come with significant investments. I'm often surprised to hear all of the new equipment and technology that's included in some of the machinery that farmers are using these days. There's a significant price tag associated with that, and in turn, there's an element of sustainability. I want to ask, as this bill progresses, and we'll talk a little bit about where things are at right now, but how do your fellow senators feel about this bill, and what do you say to those who don't believe that any sector is entitled to exemptions?
Well, there, like as in many things, there is a division of opinion, and there's a lot of people waiting to see what the arguments are. The Conservative caucus is very supportive of the bill because Senator Plett, the leader of that caucus, has often asked questions in the Senate of the government leader in the Senate, or of any minister who would come to question period who would have anything to do with the carbon tax. Senator Black from Ontario has been very persistent in quizzing the government on this and in supporting these exemptions.
Yes.
So we do have a number of people that have served on the Agriculture and Forestry Committee from the various provinces who are understanding of the issue. And they were on the committee when we submitted our report a number of months ago in regards to this. But there are others who are on a wait and see situation. And of course, when the government leader in the Senate gets up and says, well, you know, we can't make exemptions because where does it end? You know, it's the same argument the ministers have been giving me. So it's going to take a little more persuasion, I would say. But I'm very pleased at the amount of support we do have. And I would really like to get back to the Senate in Ottawa and get under a regular regime again where we're actually debating bills, because right now the Agriculture and Forestry Committee has not been stood up. So we need to get the committee going again. We need to finish the second reading on the bill, get the speeches finished that senators want to make on it, and get it referred to the committee so that we could then call in the expert witnesses.
I mean, we, along with many other farm associations, were very supportive of this. We felt the timing was right, and we felt that we had gained some significant momentum on this issue. And so, you know, the government is right now rightfully seized with responding to the needs of Canadians in the wake of the pandemic. So that was my next question for you, and I think you've answered it. Was largely around, you know, when can we expect to get back to business here, and what is the future of this bill that you've brought forward, and how can we, when we're no longer dealing with the more immediate concerns of the pandemic, how can we assist the progression of this important bill?
Well, I think first of all, it's hard to know when we will get back to it because we don't know whether the Senate will meet as a full Senate in June. Technically on June the 2nd, we're going to meet again, but I suspect it'll be those who are within ready driving distance of Ottawa, as well as only perhaps dealing with bills that are related to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But I'm hopeful that by September that we'll be back into regular session and that we'll go through the regular order paper, including dealing with this bill. Now, there's going to be a lot of things that are backed up because of the pandemic. The government budget, which normally we would have seen long ago, has not come down. That's going to be a very interesting document when it reaches the House of Commons and subsequently the Senate. So there's going to be a lot of things elbowing for attention that are really big items. So what I'm hopeful is that because this is important to this industry, that we will be able to move it along through second reading and into the committee stage. And once it gets to the Agriculture and Forestry Committee, then we're a little more in a position of being masters of our own fate, and that we decide how many witnesses we're going to call and how many meetings we're going to have. So then we would vote on it, on the bill, and make any amendments that people feel are necessary and move it back to the full Senate for a third reading debate and hopefully finally a vote. But in the current Parliament, I don't know whether it will prorogue at any point The last Parliament, the 42nd Parliament of Canada, went the whole 4 years without proroguing and having a new throne speech. So we have no idea what's going to happen here. I could easily see government priorities changing, and that at some point we will see a new throne speech. Not in the near future, but I would say it could be much more likely to happen in this, the 43rd Parliament, than it did in the last. So that's why it's so difficult to predict how long it will take to move this bill through the various stages. We've got to get back into dealing with the various stages. Right now, everything's pandemic. And most of us are home, especially those who don't live in easy driving distance of Ottawa. We're home watching the occasional Senate session on our computers.
Exactly, for now. Okay, we'll look forward to that, but I appreciate the update, and hopefully we'll get back to it next fall. Maybe in closing, I'd like to ask you, reflecting on your work over the last 4 years in the Senate and to your future in this role, what do you think you're going to get out of your time in the Senate, and what do you hope to be able to leave behind?
Well, I've got a few things in mind that I still want to do, and that's why I'm regretting this pandemic, because I'm home in Prince Edward Island and can't move things forward as fast as I would like. I'd like to move this bill through the Senate, this carbon tax bill, as I'm calling it. That's not its real name, but it deals with the consequences of the carbon tax. There's another bill that I'm sponsoring called the use of wood bill. Is to encourage more wood to be used in large buildings, and that would tie up more carbon. And there's some really large buildings being built now in Canada with wood. There's a 17-story building called the Brock Commons on the campus of the University of British Columbia. It's student residence, and it's a wood structure. It's magnificent. I had a chance to visit, and it's just magnificent. We should be doing more of that in this country, and that would tie up more carbon, as well as support the forestry industry. So there's all kinds of positive things that one can do in regards to legislation. Plus, there are some other things that, of course, other people are bringing forward that I want to sponsor, or not sponsor, support is the proper word in that case. There's another thing I'd like to do is do something that might be beneficial to wildlife before I leave Senate. And
given your background?
Yeah, given my background in land conservation, I think it's really important to look at endangered species and how these have been protected ever since the Species at Risk Act came into place. And are there changes that are needed there in the legislation, or are there changes needed in the policy, or how the government looks at species at risk and manages the situation? And of course, this often involves a lot of collaboration with the provincial government, since they have more control of the land. So it's quite an interesting topic to deal with. But because the Senate does studies and often gets complimented for the quality of the studies, I think we are uniquely placed to be able to take a really good look at endangered species and the spaces that they inhabit, and try to tie this together in a way that we can modernize it and make it more effective in terms of overall conservation. So I'd love to be able to take a jab at that before I leave.
Well, that sounds great. On that note, thank you, very much for joining us on this long weekend. We appreciate your time, Senator.
Thank you.
I'm
glad to have the opportunity to chat. That's perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. And thank you, everyone, for listening to the third episode of Fireside Chats with Erin. We will be back in 2 weeks' time with another special guest. In the meantime, if you want to stay up to date with all things related to GGC, please follow us on Twitter at Grain Growers, or on Instagram at Canada's Grain Growers. Until then.